From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have for you on the menu. Act now, idiots, the blunt message from activists and scientists to politicians over climate change. Journalists murdered. A Bulgarian reporter becomes the third journalist murdered in Europe this year. Falling flat. Failure for a controversial referendum over same-sex rights in Romania. Brexit on the brink. Is a deal really 90% done? And what could still derail it? And in tonight's Raw Moment, the winner takes it all in an epic Abba pun battle. Now it's time to meet our panel. We have Darren McCaffrey, of course, our political editor at Your News. Darren, which of these stories are you watching closely?
I think it has to be the tragic death of that journalist in Bulgaria. This is the third one we've seen in the European Union this year. Really calls into question the extent to which there is the freedom of the press in the European Union, of all places, and also what Europe and indeed these countries can do to try and stop this from happening again.
All right, we'll be talking about that. And joining us also is Linnea Engström. She's a Swedish MEP with the Greens. So which one are you watching, Linnea?
The act now, of course, idiots.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, climate change is here. We knew.
Big story today.
Yes, yes.
All right, we'll be talking about that as well. And joining us is also Mette Grolman. She's a political strategist and PR consultant in Brussels who advises governments throughout the EU. What are you watching?
Well, I'm watching the whole thing. I find everything fascinating, but I'm very interested in the Romanian election because it shows a lot of the dynamic in the Eastern Europe, how this turned out to be a non-event, basically.
All right. So all of those topics, of course, on Raw Politics. But first, let's start with our top story. As European environment ministers gather in Luxembourg tomorrow, they have a blunt message to consider. In the words of one Greenpeace activist, time is running out and leaders need to, quote, act now, idiots. It is the most extensive warning yet on the risks of rising global temperatures. And commissioned at the Paris Climate Summit 3 years ago, it urges immediate large-scale change to prevent temperatures from rising above pre-industrial levels. And it puts the responsibility directly on politicians.
The message is over to governments at this stage. We've told you the scientific facts, the evidence, the costs. It is up to the governments now to decide what to do with it.
All right, this is not the first time we've heard the dire warning. I put it to you, Mette, because you work with governments on how to communicate the message. Why is the message always falling flat?
Because it's very easy to communicate the big message. But what's actually needed when you have to address climate change affect normal people's lives. So it's very difficult to economically, and also some of these legislative proposals are just affecting people's life and economies. And it's very difficult as a politicians to look at something that might have some effect in 40 years, but sell it now, because political reality is that it's reactive to today and tomorrow, not what's going to happen in 40 years.
But what's interesting is that we had such a summer with a lot of different weather patterns, extreme weather patterns, right? So why is there still a lack of, it seems, political will, despite the fact that we're seeing the effects of climate change?
Yes, I mean, I think this report is alarming. It should make us act. I mean, otherwise we'll end up in a situation with millions of climate displaced people, climate refugees, actually. And maybe that kind of narrative is striking, is more, let's say, getting some attention in the public. I think there is lack of political leadership, actually. I think the lobbyism in this house, the lack of businesses really taking on this big challenge that makes the public very left alone with this whole climate change issue. I think now is the time to forbid the use of fossil fuels, actually. By 2030, we should ban the use of fossil fuels because we have renewable energy, we have the alternatives there, and otherwise we'll see all of these people migrating, and it's a big catastrophe, I would say.
I think, Tessa, what's really interesting is, as you say, we've seen this extraordinary summer of weather patterns, extreme temperatures across lots of Europe. This almost certainly, to a degree, part of the climate change debate. And it is the failure of politicians and, to a degree, of people like Greenpeace and the IPCC and others, to communicate that this is not something that's happening in 30 or 40 years' time. This is something that is now happening, and it is having an effect. This winter, all the peoples across Europe are paying more money for the food at the supermarkets.
Exactly.
The chips in Belgium, the frites in Belgium here are smaller because the potato crop has failed.
And we can do it quite easily. I mean, we're doing it already in Sweden, actually.
Right now.
Okay.
Right now.
All right. The European Commission, let's just bring this up, conducted a survey last year about climate change. And this is what it found. It found that 92% of respondents said they viewed climate change as a serious problem. 89% said they believed it was important for their national governments to set targets to increase renewable energy use by 2030. And 79% said that more public financial support should be given to the transition to clean energies. Now, there is a disconnect, isn't there, with what people are trying to say and what they're actually doing. I think before I go to you, because Darren, you were talking to people today.
Yeah, I went out and about, and I was first of all speaking to Tara Conley. She's from Greenpeace, about what the report is and how significant it is, but also talking to people here on a seasonally warm October day, it must be said, in Brussels. And as you said, the main thing you glean from these discussions is that everyone says the environment is a really important issue. Clearly, it's not true for everyone because not everyone's voting on it, but people aren't necessarily willing to admit that they're not interested or concerned about the environment. Let's have a watch of the people I spoke to earlier on today. Hello, we're talking about the environment. Have you seen the report today?
No, I haven't.
No, so, well, you can explain what does the report say?
It says we have to do a lot more to tackle climate action, also in Europe.
Why do you think people aren't listening or politicians aren't listening?
Other interests, perhaps? Economic interests?
You know these reports, Greenpeace have got a report out today about the environment and we need to tackle climate change. Do you think people are listening?
Maybe some of them, yes, but not everybody. I think I don't know. I think a lot of people doesn't care because we continue to take these cars and everything.
Are you listening?
Yes, I listen. I take the metro and everything, but when I need my car, I don't have any choice. But that's it.
Isn't that the problem, that in reality lots of people want to do more but they actually can't?
Yeah, and that's where, individual action also meets, government action. So governments doing more to make the choices easier for people to take the bus and the metro is something that's incredibly important.
Do you think politicians are listening or acting enough?
Probably not enough, unfortunately. But I think it's becoming more and more important, and politicians are also listening more and more.
And you're suggesting that people need to have a kick up the ass. What do you mean by that?
I mean that people have talked about climate change for a long time. We sort of know the science, we know the facts, but I think today the report has really laid it out on the table how badly we're doing on climate change and how much better we and also especially governments need to do in tackling climate change.
Europe, though, relative to the rest of the world, isn't in a bad place. But what more does the European Union kind of need to do?
I mean, historically, Europe is responsible for about 25% of historical emissions, so we have that responsibility. We also like to claim a lot of climate leadership, and I think that's something we need to live up to. We need to play a positive role in the international negotiations. And we need to remember that we're also doing this for ourselves. I mean, we've had this summer of tragic forest fires, devastating droughts. We need to recognise that this is also in our own best interest.
I'll go to you, Mette, for this one, because, we heard what people were saying. They say they are concerned, perhaps. In terms of messaging, is there a disconnect between, maybe people think that going green means giving up some parts of their standard of living?
Well, exactly, but there absolutely is a disconnect between the higher political goal and then when you have one pot of money that needs to be distributed and it has to go to infrastructure and social welfare and everything else. And what costs votes? It costs when you take away benefits from people. This just costs political votes, and that's the reality. So do you take away from social welfare and put into green investments? Well, we can all argue that at some point it's all part of the same ecosystem. But it's just very difficult.
So how do politicians weigh that?
No, but I think it's possible to do this transformation, and quite rapidly as well, because we have to do it in just a couple of years, actually, in order to meet our targets. So in my home country, Sweden, we are basically 100% fossil-free, except from the transport sector, which we need
but
to...
you think Sweden is probably an exception at the moment?
Yes, but I mean, there are vulnerable member states. Let's be honest. We have member states who are on a very, very difficult path in order to reach a fossil-free welfare state, let's say. But that's why we have the European Union. That's why we have the European project, to be in solidarity with each other and help each other towards this path. What we need is political leadership once more, and to be able to see it's possible. Let's look at the good examples and let's do it now.
But to Metta's point, how would you say that to countries that don't even have enough money for their social services, for their basic needs?
Yes.
How would you sell that?
I think the European Commission has done a pretty good job in saying that, energy efficiency, for example, so how you insulate your houses or how you produce these kind of electric devices. So 50% of how different member states meet their targets should come from energy efficiency. And that's a very powerful tool as well. So, and let's be honest, we still we could do a lot in the European Union to be more solidaric in sharing our renewable resources.
And I think politicians do need to be a bit, people need to be a bit more growing up. That this isn't a case of having your cake and eat it, a phrase we use very often in this programme, but that people will have to give things up, that it is not sustainable to consume what we do, as we do, and think that is not going to have long-term consequences. And I do think that this summer, actually, with the wildfires that we saw in Sweden, actually, and in Portugal, the opinion may well be changing on this.
Okay, but it's also
people are feeling this much more immediate to them.
But it's also about security, because right now we're importing massive amounts of oil and gas from Russia. I mean, how secure are we feeling in the European Union when we're so dependent on, dictatorship or this kind of states where they have immense atrocities against their own population? So it's also a matter of phasing out these fossil fuels to become more secure.
So do you think that, the final question, do you think that the messaging is ready when the reality might not be ready? So how can you have a message when Linnea is bringing up other issues that still need to be solved?
Well, I think you'd have to address the whole thing, but I also think you need to pick 4 instead of 15 issues that you need to address at the same time, and then go a little bit step by step. Might not see the effect of it immediately, but at least we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, you've got that report.
I should add that we've managed today to get hold of a leaked report. This is going to be published at the end of November by the Commission about its targets it's going to reach for 2050. I can tell you, Tessa, there is a big disagreement within the Commission about whether it is to be neutral by 2050 or to get rid of 80%.
Right.
And at the moment, it appears it is not, even though Jean-Claude Juncker supports it, it is not necessarily being 100% neutral.
We'll have probably another panel when this one gets
But we don't have any choice, right? I mean, we have to do it.
Thank you to our guests for the contribution. Now, let's move on to another story we're watching, to Romania. A big defeat for the ruling Conservative Party there. It held a referendum this weekend to change the constitutional definition of the family. But the vote failed after just 20% of Romanians cast their ballots. So opponents celebrated after the vote was deemed invalid. Voters were asked whether the constitutional definition of marriage should be between a man and a woman. That's despite a price tag of 40 million euros. The referendum, it does not change much, though, because Romania does not recognize same-sex marriage or civil unions. All right, let's talk about this. 20% of people. What does it mean? What does it signify that people, they didn't go the direction of Hungary and Poland, it seems, with the EU, anti-EU ballots, if you could put it that way. What does it signify for you, this?
I mean, the whole idea of having this kind of vote is appalling to me. You should be free to love anyone. That's the main values that this union is built on, right? So, and of course, voter turnout. Well, we have many problems with voter turnout in elections, but this time maybe we should be happy.
It was perhaps the EU is probably happy with that.
Yeah, I think so.
But what is the point of this vote?
Well,
because
I think so. So first of all, this vote cost $40 to $50 million US dollars, or 40 million euros. Many people said that this was a smokescreen to trying to move away from the corruption that's clearly happening, and the fact that the Social Democrats, the ruling party there, are under an awful lot of pressure. Don't forget, they had already lowered the thresholds from 50% to 30% because they feared people wouldn't turn out. They got the Orthodox Christian Church involved, who campaigned heavily. Again, that doesn't seem to have made much difference. They extended the voting days from 1 day to two to try and boost support. Now, 3 million people did sign a petition several years ago for this referendum to happen. It was constituted by the court that it was a legal referendum. What it does show, though, is that I think people are not willing to conflate issues, that on this issue, clearly, Romanians were perfectly happy with the status quo. But second of all, that this may really backfire for the Social Democrats. They invested an awful lot of time and political capital in the last couple of weeks into this referendum, trying to get it passed. That has failed to happen. And for voters, if you fail as a political party, if you fail to get people to come to the electoral box, that is damaging. That is damaging.
Yeah, some people will be looking at this as possibly posturing. All right, we have another topic to talk about now. It's time to turn back the clocks for the winter, but maybe for the last time. Here is today's Meanwhile in Brussels. Remember this? Scrap the twice-yearly seasonal clock change across the EU. Let member states decide their time zones for themselves. Well, that was the big idea in Brussels last month. But it seems the proposal has run into some trouble. According to Politico, diplomats have raised concerns about the lack of detail in the proposals and the looming April deadline for countries to make a decision. Not to mention the travel chaos that could be unleashed by the creation of numerous European time zones. With Brussels constantly being accused of power grabbing, could this have been the EU's plan all along? All right, I'll go to you, Mette, this political strategy. Do you think that was actually the plan, for people to go say, oh, actually, you know what, take the power, choose, decide, EU, go ahead?
Well, I think there was a point made, because the big on big and small on small. So I do think, actually, they were plotting a bit in the Berlaymont building here in Brussels and saying, you know what, let's show them. And let's show how difficult this actually is and push it back to the member states.
Yeah, what do you think? Do you think it was actually planned?
I don't have a clue. I think this is just a bit silly and ridiculous, and that we're voting on this in the parliament.
It was actually brought up by Juncker. All right, 10 seconds.
Voters wanted, though.
Yes, exactly.
Millions of them, so.
And mostly Germany.
Apparently, people feel really bad about these changing of clocks. I mean, they're referring to it as a real health problem. Me personally, I don't feel that way.
Jean-Claude Juncker's state of the
It's been something he has pushed repeatedly. It is, you're right, they're mostly Germans, but it is what millions of Europeans have flagged up as a big issue. So, maybe we have to deal with it.
Yeah.
But
do you imagine the train chaos? I mean, you have different time here and there.
I actually quite like when you wake up at the end of October and you realise, actually, I've got an extra hour in bed.
Yes.
I would miss that.
Thank you.
Well, that's something to miss, indeed. All right, we have a lot more coming up on Raw Politics. Crunch time for Brexit. What could make or break the divorce deal over the next 10 days? Plus, a reporter investigating corruption is murdered in Bulgaria. That's becoming the third in a year. We ask if being a journalist in Europe is becoming more dangerous. That's after the break. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, Bulgarian authorities are investigating the rape and murder of an investigative reporter. 30-year-old Victoria Marinova is the third journalist to have been killed in the EU this year. Well, Alex, in our social media news desk, The Cube, has the latest on this story. Alex?
Tessa, this is Victoria Marinova. She was, as you say, a Bulgarian television investigative journalist. She'd just relaunched a new current affairs programme called Detector. And on Saturday, she was found after she'd been raped, beaten and suffocated. Her body was found in a public park in her hometown of Rus, you can see here, in Bulgaria. Now, the Interior Minister who's gone to Rus to take over the investigation said there was no indication of a link between the work Victoria was doing and this killing. But on her very last programme, the very last edition she hosted of Detector, her investigative show, she featured journalists from investigative websites, including Bivol here, and they are looking into an alleged corruption case involving EU funds. And in fact, they have transcribed her last words on air in English. And in this, she promises that she will continue the work of investigating this case. She will continue airing the story. In less than a week, she's dead. Now, for many people, they are drawing a link and saying that this cannot simply be explained away as having no connection to her work. And a lot of journalists are speaking up on this point. In fact, Bivol, that organisation, saying that she was the only one brave enough to feature their work on air. And they are making demands of police protection for Victoria's colleagues, an independent investigation by the European Union, prosecutors from the EU. And those are strong demands. Let's not forget, let me show you the faces of these now 3 journalists killed in the European Union in the last year. And I think let's just remind ourselves of them. We start obviously with Victoria, but then we have Daphne here, who was killed by a bomb in Malta. And finally, there was a journalist as well killed earlier in the year as well. So there's a lot of points. People are drawing comparisons between these 3 and saying things have to change. And I want to just end, if I might, on the thoughts of Daphne's son, the journalist we saw there killed in Malta. He saying here, tweeting about this latest killing of Victoria, that unless this issue is addressed, he says, there is a rot that is going to the heart of Europe. He says European institutions must investigate what is going on in member states, that this can be happening. So it is a very deeply distressing story. It has sent shockwaves through the journalistic community, and many people believe that by speaking out, Victoria put herself in the sights of some very dangerous individuals. And she is now dead. Tessa.
All right, thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. And joining me in the studio for more on this, we have the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent, James Crisp, Maltese MEP with the EPP group, Roberta Metsola, and Ernest Sagaga from the International Federation of Journalists. Ernest, I'll start with you. So Victoria is the 3rd journalist murdered in the EU this year. I mean, yes, they're investigating her death, but some people are making that link. Is this a trend that we are seeing in the EU? How worried are you?
Yes, there is a trend which is now already being confirmed. We had Daphne in Malta, we had Jan in Slovakia, we even have Kim Moore in Denmark, and now Victoria. And if you across those cases, all these are investigative journalists who are being targeted for their work. So unfortunately, we are witnessing an assault on investigative journalism, and we are also seeing governments dragging their feet when it comes to investigating these crimes.
I think, well, just to bring up Kim Wall, I think that was, we could say, different circumstances, but indeed Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Malta, we are seeing that. Roberta, what kind of conversation is happening on a political level?
Well, it's obviously growing in terms of concern. And this week is when we are refocusing on the issue, not only because of the murder in Bulgaria of the journalist, but also because it's 1 year since Daphne was assassinated next Tuesday. And in fact, today, I would like to shout out the so-called Daphne Project, whereby journalists wanted to send a message that if you kill the messenger, the message is not killed. And us as politicians, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we put into place legislation, but also make sure that we do not fuel hatred towards those who have a duty to criticize us. And unfortunately, I come from a country where it's almost normal to actually attack journalists for doing one thing, after all, trying to seek the truth and doing everything to make sure that that truth comes out. What happened last year and this past year in Europe has shown us that that job is no longer secure. We have failed these persons whose job it is to society is to out with the truth, and that is where we have failed.
All right, so you're saying that in Malta you do confirm that there is an environment where journalists do feel threatened and are threatened.
Well, if you ask journalists in Malta, they will tell you that they are not able to do the job they do unless they actually praise the politicians, right? The minute you start to investigate, I mean, we have seen a makeshift memorial that has been built up for Daphne opposite the law courts. Over 20 times, government workers have been sent to remove it. at night in hiding, and we have had to go to the street, and we will go to the street again on Sunday coming, to actually ask for our society, for Malta, that has always, let's say, prized its journalists, but today we don't anymore.
I mean, James, there's also this broader question of the democratic process, democracy. It's beyond journalists' safety here.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I find most depressing about this story is I remember, very clearly after the Charlie Hebdo shootings in Paris, and I remember being here in Brussels and going to some of the vigils, and okay, you could say Charlie Hebdo is a satirical magazine, but it still felt very much like a publication. It still felt very much like it was members of my industry which had been targeted, and people were holding their placards saying, Je suis Charlie. But things have actually got worse since then. And, I'm very interested in what you were saying, Roberta. I mean, I don't know, it sounds to me from what you're saying that Malta is basically a gangster state.
Well, if a journalist is assassinated and it is clear that whoever has commissioned the murder is nowhere close to being found, then I have to worry. And that is why in the European Parliament we have set up a cross-party group to precisely look into rule of law issues in the European Union. The European Union is not only about economic agreements, it is about values, which we fought so hard for when we wanted to join. I mean, I was part of the campaign for Malta to join the European Union, and that was one of the things we wanted, to make sure that our institutions are, let's say, addressed, are seen to work as though the rule of law actually functioning. And it's a pity that there is a monitoring group that is focusing on Slovakia and Malta. I wish there wasn't, but unfortunately that's what it is.
I do want to check if we have our Skype guest, because we do think we have someone else joining us from the Skype. Well, two journalists, one from the investigative news website Bivol, were arrested last month. They were working with Victoria Marinova on a story involving alleged corruption in EU-funded projects in Bulgaria. And joining us live is Bivol's editor, Atanas Chobanov. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Did you know Victoria Marinova?
I don't know her personally. She worked with our journalists.
All right. And how dangerous is it then, can you tell us, to be a journalist in Bulgaria?
It is very dangerous, especially when you investigate high-profile political corruption. And this is the case with our investigation that Victoria exposed on air. She was extremely brave to speak about this.
Have you had threats yourself?
We had threats ourselves, but we are investigative journalists who are experienced, and we manage with the threats. We know how to protect us. The problem here is that the Bulgarian authorities didn't start an investigation even after our journalists were arrested by police, because they tried to save from the destruction evidence about a big network of people who are siphoning European funds. So this investigation now is moving to next level, but it was only after the killing of Victoria made a buzz, which is unfortunately not to be the case.
So is this kind of environment something that journalists in Bulgaria kind of just say, okay, it's part of my job, it's part of how Bulgaria is like? Is this something they just have to accept and deal with?
We know that investigative journalism is dangerous stuff. We know countries where it's even more dangerous, and we are happy that we are working in the European Union, which is a relatively protected environment. But this year, with 3 killings, we are not more confident in authorities that they can protect us.
All right, and very quickly, what needs to be changed for journalists to be protected, do you think? Very quickly.
Journalists cannot be protected by bills. They must be protected by a general assessment of and general authorities' involvement in investigations, and not in our case. We are alone against the state. We are alone against the criminals, and we don't have the support. We didn't have the support until recently for our work.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. Atanas Chobanov, you're the editor of Bivol newspaper. Thank you. All right. Reporters Without Borders released annual WordPress Freedom Index earlier this year, and it called the situation in Bulgaria difficult. The country also fared worse than any other EU nation, ranking 111th out of 180 countries, down 2 spots from the previous year. And Serbia ranked 76, followed by Hungary and Poland at 73rd and 58th place, respectively. I want to put to you, is there an East-West divide that you're seeing here in Europe with regard to the quality, the rule of law, and the treatment of journalists?
Well, I want to caution about East and West, because this problem is actually very reminiscent of what is going on in other parts of the world. We have many countries where many journalists are being killed. The reasons are similar. People who attack journalists, they do so in order to suppress free speech and free press. And the only difference between the other parts of the world and Europe, being European Union and the wider Europe, is that you could actually find a stronger political will in the EU to fight against these kind of crimes, and also the ability of their institutions to investigate these crimes. What is happening now in Bulgaria, in Malta, and in Slovakia, there are people who are testing the will, political will, and the ability of these institutions to make a difference. That's why we need to take very seriously these cases. It's not about West and East, it's about Europe and the rest of the world.
All right.
One thing I'd say is as well, that people in these governments, they're being given a green card, the green light to go ahead with this sort of stuff from Donald Trump. The most powerful man in the world stands up, mocks journalists, he calls them enemy of the people. That sets an example. I mean, there's an argument to be had about how much power the EU actually has to safeguard these freedoms, these rights. I mean, personally, I would feel more comfortable if each country safeguarded their own rights. That doesn't look like it's entirely possible at the moment. But the fact is, Trump is making this okay.
All right, so we're seeing an environment around the world, as you're all pointing out.
As James has just said, I mean, this has meant that we have to set up a rule of law mechanism whereby each member state is analysed, and where there are deficiencies, the European Commission can come into act. This is where the European Parliament has actually been at the forefront of protecting journalists. But
an increase in Euroscepticism.
And the government and the ministries and the governments have to actually accept such an initiative from the European Parliament, but we're still seeing very big resistance from the government on this. This is the problem.
Okay. All right. A lot of discussion to be had on that topic, but let's move on for now, because there was a minor political earthquake in Latvia this weekend. Let's find out what happened in today's Power Play. Celebrating victory. The leader of Latvia's Harmony Party meets supporters after triumphing in the country's parliamentary election. The Russia-friendly party won the most votes this weekend, followed by the two populist parties. With coalition negotiations set to begin, Harmony is trying to position itself as the kingmaker. But it has always seen itself shut out of government amid concerns over its pro-Russia stance. It has tried to rebrand as a Western-style social democratic party, but severed official ties to Putin's United Russia Party only last year. And that's something that's got Donald Tusk worried. The European Council president was visiting his native Poland this weekend, and he took aim at Russia's influence in Europe.
Ale nie mam żadnych wątpliwości co do jednego, że Rosja ma najbardziej skonkretyzowane interesy związane z Unią Europejską i są to interesy w dużej mierze negatywne.
We called it a minor earthquake. James, what do you think about the pull of Russia? I mean, there really is one, is there?
Well, I mean, Russia is a massive country, and Lithuania has a large has a large Russian-speaking minority, and we've heard this story before, haven't we? We've seen it in Crimea. And, I think that Putin has shown that he is very willing to use any influence through any methods that he sees fit. We've seen that in Britain, for example. I'm not surprised, but I'm heartened, as always, when Donald Tusk comes out and gives the hard line back, because I think that's the only language Mr. Putin understands.
Do you think there is a difficulty on a political level to, let's say, have this tug of war with Russia? I mean,
well, we're finding ourselves increasingly sandwiched between Trump and Putin. And if we don't push back, as Donald Tusk did, and said that we are concerned that the creeping influence of Russia, we have to push back, then we risk becoming either irrelevant or taken over. And this is, I'm not being alarmist, this result is concerning.
All right, what would you like to add to that, the Russian influence in this sphere in Europe?
Well, I think it doesn't help when journalists begin to become commentators. We know that's not our job. Our job is to report on facts. But I will have to say this, where you have passion this high, it's very important that all views are heard. Minority, majority, so that's what democracy is all about. Having all sides being heard, given a fair hearing. And then in the end, democracy is about people making their own decision based on informed decisions.
All right, well, there we go. All right, we'll leave it at that for now, because after the break, we have Brexit on the brink. Is a divorce deal imminent? We tell you about the negotiation frenzy ahead. Don't go away. All right, welcome back. This has reportedly been dubbed Hell Week by one EU cabinet minister, the beginning of an intensive 10-day push to reach consensus on the most contentious Brexit issues before European leaders gather next week. Kicking things off today, Theresa May's top EU advisor, Ollie Robbins, is in Brussels working on the withdrawal agreement. Tomorrow, Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon addresses her party after pushing for independence and a people's vote. While in Brussels, DUP leader Arlene Foster meets with EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier. And on Wednesday, Barnier will address the European Parliament. And then on Thursday, Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab is back in Brussels for more talks. Well, over the weekend, Ireland's foreign minister went so far as to say the deal is 90% done. So what 10% are they still working on? And to discuss all of this, I'm joined by Darren McCaffrey. He's back, our political editor at Euronews. James Crisp, Brussels correspondent for The Telegraph. And joining us is Brian McGuire. He's a reporter with Euractiv here in Brussels. All right, 90% done. I mean, how fast did that change? Who wants to go first?
Well, unfortunately, things aren't going quite as smoothly as we were led to believe up until very, very recently. In fact, Dominic Raab, while we all expected him to be here on Thursday, that is being marked down as a very, very, very much a TBC, to be confirmed.
Okay.
It looks like the mood music which we've been hearing, the deal is nearly there, 90%. Now, 90% might be accurate for the withdrawal agreement. But when the rest is the Irish border, that's the main issue. Without that, nothing gets done.
So that's the 10%. So the Irish border, what else do we have?
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, over the last couple of days, as you said, we've heard from Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister. We've heard from Jean-Claude Juncker, who said, I thought a deal could be done by the end of October, if not November, and Donald Tusk as well, saying it will be done in the next couple of months. And interesting, I think, is this, it almost seemed like it was a deliberate strategy. To try and kind of essentially get the British
There's one voice missing, isn't there?
Yeah. There is one voice missing. Theresa May, rather interesting, or a spokesperson today, playing that down substantially, saying that we shouldn't necessarily be that optimistic, while hopeful, of course, that a deal will happen.
Yeah, Brian, I'll go to you on what do you think the Irish border is such a massive...
as well. Theresa May's voice is still absent from this, and it seems like a rope-a-dope strategy in some ways. After Salzburg and the disaster that she had there too, that the idea that this mood music James speaks about, move everybody along, and then we get in the room and nothing gets done, and it's another shambles for Theresa May at the end. We've got October summit coming up. It looks more like preparation, but Macron said that if things weren't done in October, he wasn't going to attend.
But it looks like she's going to give in, don't you think?
Well, she has to. And
give in to the EU's version of...
She has to give in to the EU to get something, but she'll never be able to sell it back home again.
All right, well, you're doubtful.
I'm doubtful that she can give in on the border. I mean, the problem is we're now getting to a stage where we're talking about very nerdy bits of language. So she won't accept a border in the Irish Sea. She won't accept a customs border. But she'll accept border checks on regulatory standards, because that is different. How is that different? Honestly, I've got no idea.
And to a degree already exists, because there already are some checks on the border between Great Britain and the rest of Ireland.
10 seconds.
It's a nicety.
So, I mean, essentially...
All right, I'll give you the last word, because we have 10 seconds. So, Brian.
The Irish Sea is border checks already exist. The DUP won't accept them. Theresa May has nowhere to go.
And the can can no longer be kicked down the road, which it has been for the last
Very
year.
pessimistic.
The can can always be kicked down the road in Brussels.
All right, now, the European Commission press briefings aren't exactly known as places of great hilarity. James here, you showed how to lighten things up last week after Theresa May danced to Abba at her party conference. So let's take a look at tonight's Raw Moment.
Has our ABBA-loving Prime Minister danced her way into your hearts? Voulez-vous a deal? Will you take a chance on May, or is she about to face her Waterloo? And will the winner take it all? Thank you.
My, how can I resist you, James? Okay, well, we appreciate a little dancing. It always takes two to tango. We prefer that the tune was Dancing Queen rather than The Winner Takes It All. And what can I say? Breaking up is never easy. I know.
Let Brian react to that, not James.
This is very typical James. It must take 3 hours to prepare that.
How long did it take, James?
I've seen him write scripts.
It was done on the cuff, off the cuff.
Off the cuff.
Are you that big an ABBA fan?
I'm a huge ABBA fan. In fact, I urge you all to look on Twitter, because Jean-Claude Juncker has now done his own version of Theresa May's dance.
Yeah, so that's what you all have to do. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Go on Twitter. Do tell us what you're talking about. I'm at Tessa Arcilia, and you can also go at Euronews and use the hashtag #RawPolitics. Have a good evening.